Good morning, friends. Today I want to bring you something that comes out of yesterday's sermon, but isn't itself related to the topic of yesterday's sermon. And that comes from the time we spent considering the life of Job. Because even though we didn't talk about it too much in much depth yesterday, Job suffered, right? And he suffered a lot. And one reason why Job suffered was because God was demonstrating his sovereignty over all things. He was demonstrating his sovereignty in having established a hedge of protection around Job prior to Satan coming before God. He was demonstrating his sovereignty in permitting Job to suffer at the hands of Satan. And then he was demonstrating his sovereignty in restoring Job at the conclusion of the account. Now, obviously, the book of Job has to do with suffering then. We see Job suffering. We see his friends' reaction to his suffering. And we see how Job tries to process that suffering. But really, the greater message of the book of Job has to do with God's sovereignty even when we suffer. The context is suffering, but the overarching message is God's sovereignty. That is the main takeaway of the book of Job. God is sovereign, and we can trust him in that sovereignty. And yes, Job had to suffer in order to learn that lesson. And in that suffering, or for that reason, he suffered. And we are able to learn that lesson as well. Job's story, his life, that account is available for us now as well. But then one might ask, isn't the Lord kind of cruel to make Job go through all of that suffering just to teach him and us that lesson? Couldn't there have been another way? Well, at that point, we remember the words of the Apostle Paul in Romans 8:18. For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us. And this is something we have a hard time with because all we can see right now is our immediate circumstances. And when those circumstances involve suffering, it's hard to see past that. But we must also remember that the psalmist tells us that man is like a breath. His days are like a passing shadow. Another psalm says, behold, you, God, have made my days a few handbreadths, and my lifetime is as nothing before you. And oftentimes when we read such statements like that, we think of them in a negative sense. You know, we're born, we live a short while, when we die, and we have this futility idea that comes from that. But that's such an earthly way to look at it. Because when we embrace the fact that these earthly lives are but a breath, a mere shadow, then we remember that even the worst sufferings are also but a breath. And there is so much greater to come. That is why the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed in us, or at least a big reason why. Because the sufferings of this present time, comparatively speaking, are so very brief. And if we've embraced the Lord of heaven and earth, we must embrace that as reality. For illustration, and I hope significant encouragement, there's a Christian preacher I listen to from time to time by the name of Justin Peters. Mr. Peters suffers from cerebral palsy, and if I understand correctly, is generally restricted to a wheelchair because of his disability. And one time, responding to some who questioned whether or not he is bitter about his disability and the fact that he's so confined, he said, if I have to live the rest of my life with cerebral palsy, that's fine, because I have the rest of eternity to live without it. Friends, what a wonderful perspective to have. The sufferings of this life are not worthy to compare to the glory yet to come. And that includes whatever suffering God allows you or me to experience. It includes whatever suffering God allows Justin Peters to experience. It includes all the suffering that God allowed even Job to experience. Because I guarantee you that right now Job is with the Lord, and he is glad to have been used by the Lord to teach the lesson of God's sovereignty to all those who followed him and who were able to read the account of his life. God is sovereign. He is trustworthy. And there are times, like in Job's case, where we never find out why, at least not in this earthly lifetime, why it was exactly that we had to suffer. But God has demonstrated in every other way that he is worthy of our trust. And even though this flies in the face of everything our world demands, we don't need to know all of the whys when it comes to God's purposes, because all of the whys that we do know demonstrate that he is trustworthy. And whatever suffering we experience now, even if we don't know the specifics of it, they are not worthy of comparing with the glory yet to come. And there will be a day when we will understand why in all its fullness. And like Job, we will have been glad. We will be glad to have gone through whatever we did, because we'll see why God did it and why it had to happen. So be encouraged, friends, and have a good and godly day. I love you, and I do hope to see you soon.